$15,000 was burning every hour the Spartacus set stood still. The crew knew it. The studio knew it. And the man responsible for that silence was about to meet Kirk Douglas. When you're both the star and the producer, walking onto a dead set isn't just embarrassing. It's a direct challenge to your control. Douglas had a choice that November morning in 1959. Accept the chaos, or do something no leading man had ever done in Hollywood's history. He chose violence. Not physical. Something far more brutal. The kind that ends in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, with no second chance. If you want to see how power really works in Hollywood, subscribe now, because what happens next will show you why Kirk Douglas became the most feared man in the industry. November 1959. Universal Studios was betting everything on Spartacus. The budget had already ballooned to $6 million, an astronomical sum that made nervous executives check their watches every 15 minutes. Kirk Douglas wasn't just the star of this Roman epic. He was the producer, the money man, the ultimate authority. On paper, at least. Because right now, on stage 12, his authority was being tested in the most expensive way possible. Anthony Mann had credentials that intimidated most people in Hollywood. He directed James Stewart in Winchester 73. He'd crafted westerns that defined masculinity on screen. When Universal brought him onto Spartacus, they thought they were getting a safe pair of hands, a professional who could handle scope and scale. What they got instead was a creative vision that collided head-on with Kirk Douglas's iron will. And in Hollywood, collision means combustion. The problem started small, the way all disasters do. Mann wanted authenticity in every frame. He'd spend 45 minutes adjusting a Roman soldier's sandal strap. He'd halt production because the light hitting a pillar wasn't precisely the shade of amber he'd envisioned. Perfectionism has its place in cinema, but perfectionism costs money, and money has a clock attached to it. By the second week of shooting, they were 3 days behind schedule. By the third week, that gap had doubled. And Kirk Douglas was watching his investment hemorrhage with every sunset that arrived without usable footage. But it wasn't just about money. Something deeper was happening on that set, something that threatened the entire hierarchy of power Douglas had constructed. Mann wasn't just slow, he was dismissive. When Douglas would approach with a suggestion about blocking or pacing, Mann would nod politely and then shoot the scene exactly as he'd planned. The crew noticed. Hollywood always notices. Whispers started circulating through the lot. Kirk Douglas, the man who'd clawed his way up from poverty, who'd built his production company on the force of his personality, was being ignored on his own set. In an industry where perception equals reality, that was a death sentence Douglas couldn't afford. The day everything changed started like any other nightmare. The call time was 6 in the morning. 300 extras arrived in buses, their faces still creased with sleep, ready to be transformed into Roman citizens and slaves. The makeup department worked their magic. Costume assistants laced sandals and adjusted togas. By 8 o'clock, stage 12 was a living, breathing recreation of ancient Rome. Hundreds of people in position, cameras loaded, lights blazing at full intensity, burning through electricity and patience in equal measure. Anthony Mann arrived at 8:30. Not unusual. Directors often use that pre-shoot time for last-minute preparations. But 8:30 became 9 o'clock. 9 became 9:30. The extras stood in their marks. The crew leaned against equipment. The assistant director kept glancing at his watch, calculating the cost of every passing minute. $15,000 an hour. That's $250 every 60 seconds. The sound of money evaporating is silent, but everyone on that set could hear it. Mann finally emerged from his trailer at 10 o'clock, carrying a notebook filled with sketches and shot lists. He walked through the set with the deliberate pace of a man who believed time bent to his will. He studied angles. He consulted with his cinematographer in hushed, urgent tones. He moved an urn 3 inches to the left, and the 300 people in Roman costume continued to stand, waiting, while the clock devoured Universal's money. What Mann didn't know was that Kirk Douglas had been in his own trailer since 7 that morning. Not preparing, not rehearsing, watching. Douglas had a clear view of stage 12 from his window, and he'd been monitoring every moment of this slow-motion disaster. He saw Mann arrive late. He watched the aimless wandering, the endless consultations, the obsessive adjustments that led nowhere. And with every minute that passed, Douglas was making calculations of his own, not about art or vision or the integrity of the film, about power, about control, about what happens when you let someone challenge your authority in front of an audience. By 11 o'clock, Mann still hadn't called for a single take. The extras were shifting their weight, muscles cramping from standing in place. The crew had stopped pretending to look busy and were now openly sitting, some playing cards, others smoking in corners. The entire production had become a monument to paralysis, and everyone knew that Kirk Douglas was watching. Some of them had worked with Douglas before. They knew his reputation. They knew that when Kirk Douglas felt disrespected, someone paid the price. And right now, the bill was coming due. At 11:47, Kirk Douglas stepped out of his trailer. He didn't hurry. Hurrying would suggest anxiety, and anxiety suggested weakness. He walked across the lot with the measured stride of a man who'd already made his decision, who was now simply executing a plan. When he reached stage 12, he paused at the entrance, taking in the scene with the cold assessment of a general surveying a failed battlefield. 300 people noticed his arrival simultaneously. Conversations died mid-sentence. Card games froze. Even the background hum of the sound equipment seemed to lower in volume. Kirk Douglas had that effect. It wasn't just his square jaw or his intense eyes or the way he carried himself like a coiled spring. It was something deeper, something primal. He radiated consequence. When Kirk Douglas entered a room, people understood instinctively that decisions were about to be made, and those decisions would have weight. Anthony Mann was conferring with his cinematographer near camera A when Douglas approached. Mann looked up, perhaps expecting a collegial check-in, maybe even some words of encouragement from a star. What he got instead was silence. Douglas stood 6 feet away, arms crossed, watching. Just watching. The crew understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't a conversation. This was an evaluation. This was judgment being rendered in real time. Mann attempted a smile, that universal gesture of deflection. He started to explain his vision for the opening shot, how he wanted to capture the scope of Rome's power through a slow, sweeping movement that would establish the world before introducing the characters. It was probably a brilliant idea. Mann's ideas usually were. But Douglas wasn't listening to the idea. He was listening to the cost of the idea, the time the idea required, the control the idea demanded. Douglas let Mann talk for exactly 45 seconds. Those who were close enough to hear said later that he didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't engage with the creative explanation at all. He simply waited until Mann finished his pitch, let the silence hang for 3 beats, and then said 4 words that would echo through Hollywood history. "Show me your footage." That's when Mann understood this wasn't a creative discussion. This was an audit. Douglas walked to the editing bay, a small room adjacent to the soundstage where dailies were reviewed. Mann followed, and behind them, like a funeral procession, came the cinematographer, the assistant director, and several key crew members. Everyone else stayed frozen on set, but the tension had changed quality. This was no longer the frustration of waiting. This was the electric anticipation of witnessing something definitive. The editing bay was cramped, designed for 2 people, but now holding 7. Douglas took the seat directly in front of the moviola, the machine that allowed filmmakers to view footage frame by frame. Mann stood behind him, probably still believing this was a temporary setback, maybe even an opportunity to demonstrate his artistic choices. The assistant editor threaded the film, and the room filled with the mechanical clicking of sprockets engaging. Kirk Douglas watched exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds of footage. Not the full dailies. Not even a complete scene. Just 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Those who were in that room described his posture as absolutely still, his face revealing nothing, his eyes tracking every frame with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. And he found flaws. Not in the artistry necessarily, but in something far more damaging: the efficiency. The footage showed a single scene. Roman guards escorting a line of slaves through a courtyard. Beautiful composition, excellent lighting, the kind of shot that might win awards for cinematography. But it had taken an entire day to capture. An entire day for 30 seconds of screen time. At that rate, Spartacus would take 3 years to complete and cost $20 million. Universal would collapse. Careers would end. And Kirk Douglas would be remembered not as a visionary, but as the man who destroyed his own dream through lack of control. Douglas stopped the moviola mid-frame. The silence in that editing bay was the kind that makes people forget to breathe. He stood slowly, turned to face Anthony Mann, and delivered the sentence that would define Hollywood power dynamics for the next generation. "You're done here." Not "this isn't working." Not "we need to make some changes." Not even "you're fired." Just 3 words. "You're done here." The finality was absolute. The simplicity was devastating. Mann started to respond, perhaps to argue or negotiate or appeal to artistic integrity. But Douglas had already turned away, walking out of the editing bay without looking back, without discussion, without anything resembling second-guessing. What happened next happened fast. Within an hour, Anthony Mann's belongings were removed from his trailer. Within 2 hours, his name was stripped from all production documents. By end of business that day, Stanley Kubrick was on a plane to Los Angeles, about to take over the biggest film of his career. And Kirk Douglas had established something unprecedented in Hollywood: an actor-producer who could fire a director mid-production and make it stick. Not through studio politics, not through contractual maneuvering, through pure, undiluted assertion of will. The news spread through Hollywood faster than gossip, faster than scandal. By the next morning, every executive, every agent, every director knew what Kirk Douglas had done. The reactions varied. Some called it brave, others called it reckless. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was absolute. Douglas had crossed a line that most actors never even approached. He'd fired a respected director in front of witnesses, mid-production, without consultation or committee. He'd made himself judge, jury, and executioner. And he'd done it so decisively that there was no room for debate. Anthony Mann never spoke publicly about what happened on the Spartacus set. He went on to direct other films, good films, but his career trajectory changed that day. He'd been humiliated in front of 300 people. In Hollywood, that kind of public defeat leaves marks that never fully fade. Years later, when asked about Spartacus, Mann would deflect, change the subject, or claim creative differences. But those who knew the real story understood. Anthony Mann had been erased, not just from a project, but from a moment in history. For Kirk Douglas, the firing became legend. It cemented his reputation as a man who didn't negotiate, didn't compromise, didn't accept challenges to his authority. Future directors approached Spartacus with a new understanding. They weren't just working for Kirk Douglas. They were working under Kirk Douglas. Stanley Kubrick, brilliant and uncompromising in his own right, found ways to collaborate that Mann never could, perhaps because Kubrick understood what that editing bay moment had taught everyone. Kirk Douglas would rather destroy his own project than surrender control. The film went on to massive success. Spartacus became a cultural phenomenon, won Oscars, and established Kirk Douglas as not just a star, but a power broker. And every time someone praised the film's vision or its scope, Kirk Douglas knew something the audience never would. That vision came at the cost of a man's career, executed in 4 minutes, sealed with 3 words, witnessed by 300 people who never forgot what they saw. What Kirk Douglas did on that November morning in 1959 changed Hollywood in ways that still resonate today. He proved that actors could wield power beyond their performance. That production credits weren't just titles, but weapons. That control, once challenged, had to be defended with absolute force or it ceased to exist at all. Other actors watched and learned. Clint Eastwood would later build an entire directing career on similar principles of control. Warren Beatty would produce and star in his own epics. The actor-producer-director hybrid became a standard model, and it all traced back to Kirk Douglas standing in that editing bay, watching 4 minutes of footage and ending a man's involvement with 3 words. But there was a cost beyond Anthony Mann's career. Douglas created a culture of fear on his sets. Efficiency improved, yes. Control was maintained, absolutely. But collaboration suffered. Creative voices learned to stay silent rather than risk the kind of public execution Mann endured. Hollywood gained powerful actor-producers but lost something in the process. The safety to take creative risks when those risks might slow down the machine or challenge the authority at the top. Kirk Douglas lived with that decision for the rest of his long life. He never expressed regret, never suggested he'd have done things differently. In interviews, he described the Spartacus production with pride, focusing on the victories, the box office, the cultural impact. But those who knew him well said he carried something with him from that day. Not guilt exactly, maybe just the weight of understanding what he'd proven. That in Hollywood, power isn't given or earned through artistry alone. Sometimes it's seized in 4 minutes, executed in broad daylight, and maintained through the willingness to end careers without hesitation. The crew members who witnessed that day never forgot it. Some of them worked in the industry for decades afterward, and when they trained younger generations, they'd tell the story of Kirk Douglas and Anthony Mann, not as a cautionary tale or a celebration, but as a simple truth about how Hollywood really functions. The story became mythology, the mythology became lesson, and the lesson was this. In an industry built on illusion, power is the only thing that's absolutely real. And on one November morning in 1959, Kirk Douglas made sure everyone understood he possessed it completely.